Welcome to St. Philip, the Deacon Lutheran Church. We've been expecting you. I'm Susan Path. I'm the parish nurse here at St. Philip, the Deacon, and we welcome all of you that are present, the hundreds of you that are present here today, and the thousands of you that are online watching us and live streaming. Welcome. And if you're here to see the Olympics, you're not on the right channel, but you can stay and join us. How many of you are first-time St. Philip the Deacon attenders? Raise your hands. Oh my gosh. Well, there's one there. Oh, hundreds of you. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. We welcome you. You're right in the right place if you came for the presentation on trauma and hope. And if you have questions during the presentation, please email them to social@spdlc.org. That's social@spdlc.org. And we will be having a Q&A session at the end, and we will use your questions that you have, so please send those in. You should have received handouts if you pre-registered, and I guess you received 4 of them because I sent it to myself and I never got them, and they weren't in my junk mail, so I'm not sure what happened. But Renee said she got 4 of them, so you're well prepared. You have all of the handouts, and we welcome you. And I would like to begin with a devotion, and I would like to introduce Clay Thomas, who is our middle school ministry and in charge of the programs for that, and a collaborator with this presentation tonight. Clay, thank you for starting us out.
Thank you, Susan. I want to give us a quick kind of focusing point. So we go to the story of Exodus in the 18th chapter. 2 quick verses to kind of focus us. Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What are you doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." We host these events and we talk about these topics because, like Moses' father-in-law, whose name is Jethro, which is wonderful, by the way, points out that we cannot do these things alone. So we gather together to talk and to be a community like we've been created to be. We've been created to be in community with one another. And as Moses' father-in-law points out, this is not to be done alone. We gather together to talk and to listen and to be joyous and to mourn together. And in Paul's letter to Corinth, he writes, your abundance may be a supply for their need. And so sometimes in your life, you will be Moses, where it needs to be pointed out that you are not to be alone. And sometimes you will be a Jethro, to point out of your abundance that help is needed. So I am glad to introduce Anne, our presenter. Oh, back to Susan. I'll bring it back to Susan for the rest of the intros.
Thank you, Clay. That was beautiful. Okay, trauma has been around since the beginning of time. The Kaiser's ACEs study was done in 1995 to 1997. Do your math. How many years ago is that? 27 years ago. And it was probably been said that it's one of the most important research that was the least looked at and the least studied at the beginning. But it's been looked at over and over now through the years. Response to traumas by individuals is related to the resources that they have and the experience that we have encountered. And God has created us as loving social creatures. We are wired to commune together, to play and have social activities. Together, this connectiveness can heal one another. We can hurt each other profoundly and deeply, but we can heal each other profoundly. And that's what Anne is here to talk to us about all the hurts that happen to people and the healing that we can all be involved with, that we want to start the conversations with here at St. Philip the Deacon, to go out to the rest of our community, the rest of the world in this time where there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of dissonance, a lot of hurt, a lot of anger. So we want to look at restoring life. And Anne Ellison, who is here with us today, is the youngest of 7 children, so probably had a lot of trauma with 7 children in her family. But she learned very early from her mother that food was a way to connect, and she cooks and serves food as a way to connect and serve others. So if you're attending here tonight in person, she made us a 7-course meal that we'll be having afterwards. Sorry about you online. I guess I'll have to talk to her if she'll give us a rain check for you, but right now we'll enjoy that afterwards. I do not know her favorite recipe, but we will find that out by the end of the questioning. But food is a great way to connect. Anne has worked in healthcare for 35 plus years and is currently manager of Interfaith for M Health Fairview, providing leadership to Fairview Interfaith Health Collaborative, a network of more than 100 faith communities and organizations, which St. Philip the Deacon is part. Anne has a BA in social work and an MA in health and human services as service administration. She completed a fellowship in cultural competence leadership and is an advanced care planning trainer and a trainer in risking connection in faith communities class, a curriculum for faith leaders supporting trauma survivors. And I actually attended that class. That's one of the reasons that I am here. And that was several years ago, before the pandemic. And there was a lot of work being done there of working with trauma survivors from different racial groups and different communities at that time. And we're continuing that with this. Anne is passionate about her role in faith communities and what they can play in the health and well-being of their members and their communities. So we welcome her to St. Philip the Deacon to show us, shed a light more on trauma and how we can bring hope to those around us as we go forward. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thunderous applause.
I am on. Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. Before I get started, let me preface the presentation by saying I am not an expert in child development. I am not an expert in brain development, but I have information. I heard information. I've learned information that I think is so critical today as we all work together to try and look at trauma and healing from trauma, and that is why I have passion for the information I'm going to share with you. Through the training that Susan mentioned, the Risking Connection in Faith Community training, I learned a lot about trauma-informed congregations, and that's the work we continue to do, and how to move from trauma-informed to trauma-responsive. I became a trainer in that curriculum, and that training brought me to this HOPE information, and we'll talk a lot about that. I believe the HOPE framework, and there is science behind it. This isn't just something somebody came up with. There is science and studies that we'll talk about that is behind this information, and it's so essential as we live in community these days where there is a lot of trauma, both individual and community-based trauma. In order to talk about the HOPE framework, we need to back up a little bit, as Susan mentioned, and talk a little bit about ACEs, and I apologize for those of you who know the ACEs study around adverse childhood experiences. I will be quick and try not to dwell on it, but I want to make sure everybody has sort of that same grounding of information. The ACEs study, as Susan mentioned, was first published in 1998 and was completed by Drs. Anda and Felitti with Kaiser and the CDC. And the population that was studied in the ACEs study was Kaiser's HMO population. So insured folks, largely white folks, mostly employed middle to upper class individuals. So that was the study, and it was over 17,000 people in that study, right? It really clearly established the relationship between 10 adverse childhood experiences, though you see on the screen, and poor health outcomes. The 10 ACEs fall into 3 categories, and you see those: abuse, meaning emotional, physical, or sexual; neglect, meaning emotional and physical neglect; and then finally that 3rd category they call household challenges, including things like domestic abuse, the loss of a parent through death or divorce, substance use in the home, household mental illness, and a family member who is incarcerated. So those are what they call the 10 adverse childhood experiences. There's a great deal of data that came out of that ACEs study, a lot of data, and there's a lot of information that's come since that study. But let me hit some highlights of that original study, which is why it really piqued everyone's interest. In the study, 2/3 of that 17,000 plus participants reported at least one ACE, 2/3. 40% of the participants had 2 or more ACEs. Those that had 4 or more ACEs were twice as likely to smoke. They were 7 times more likely to be alcoholic. And those with 6 or more ACEs, and this was one that kind of shook me when I read it, those with 6 or more ACEs were at risk of shortening their lifespan by 20 years. That's a huge number. Overall, the findings really established the relationship between early childhood experiences, those ACEs, ACEs, and poor health outcomes. At a very high level, we've learned all kinds of things since that study was completed. But what we know is this: that ACEs are common, with most people experiencing at least one. ACEs are highly interrelated, and they often co-occur. ACE exposure has a graded dose-response relationship. In other words, the higher the number of ACEs, the higher the likelihood of poor health outcomes. And then finally, the ACE research really exposed this issue of the connection between trauma and poor health outcomes. We know that that's what that did. Let's keep going. So why is it that ACEs have such a significant impact on future health outcomes? Well, what we know is that when individuals are exposed to ACEs or other traumatic experiences, maybe not one of those 10, there's a natural body's stress response that happens, right? Your heart starts to pump, your cortisol level goes up, your adrenaline level goes up, right? That's your natural fight, flight, or freeze response when you're in a scary, traumatic situation. If that activation of that stress response is prolonged over time or repeated frequently, it can derail healthy development in children and disrupt health for adults. We call this prolonged stress response toxic stress. In simple terms, if you want to dig a little deeper into this, there's a 14-minute TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, if you ever want to look it up, where she talks about if you're out in the woods and you encounter a bear, your heart's going to start pumping. You're going to figure out fight, flight, or freeze, and all that kicks in. That's your natural response. All well and good if you're in the woods and there's a bear. But what happens if the bear comes home every night? And that response kicks in so repeatedly, it really derails brain development. It impacts impulse control, decision-making, judgment, and overall cognitive skills. I don't know if you've seen this, but this is from the World Health Organization. It was an early on graphic that talked about, it sort of pictured what it was, the impact of ACEs. So at the bottom, you have the experience of adverse childhood experiences. Moving up the pyramid, you have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Moving up, you have the adoption of high-risk health behaviors. And then you have disease, disability, and social problems, ultimately leading to early death. It's a pretty clear graphic in terms of the depiction of it. What I like now is a more recent graphic that they're now calling the pair of ACEs. So you see the 10 adverse childhood experiences on the top, but you see adverse community environments as the roots of the tree. And it really recognizes that the impact of what we call the social determinants of health, things like discrimination, poverty, lack of opportunity, economic or otherwise, violence in the community. So it really sets the context in those roots, because you have to take into context both of those things, individual family dynamics, but there's also impact from the community overall. What all of this really did for many of us who work in healthcare and schools and other settings with children is really shift the thinking from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Think about that. It's not about having an excuse for behavior. It's about having an explanation for the behavior. So if you can explain it, you're more likely to understand it. If you can understand it, you're more likely to empathize or provide compassion and that understanding, and we're more likely to be kind and caring towards one another. Again, not an excuse, but an explanation. So in this context here at Philip the Deacon, when I've done this training, we talk a little bit about some examples of behavior that you just kind of go, what is wrong with you? Shift it. And we talk about the church kitchen lady. The lady in the church who knows where everything in the kitchen is, who knows every event that goes on, knows how to cook for a crowd, and knows what everybody should be doing, sometimes to the point of being a little gruff about it. What else might be going on? Maybe she doesn't have control anywhere else in her life. Think about asking the question, what's wrong here? Not what's wrong here. What happened to you? Right? When I worked as a medical social worker, we used to talk in discharge planning about the daughter from California who came in and just mucked everything up when we had a plan for a discharge. Well, okay, let's think about this. What happened? She's far away. She may not know all the details. She's scared, and she wants what's best for her loved one. It's not about what's wrong with her and why is she mucking everything up, but maybe what's going on. What has happened that influences the behavior? Think about this shift from what is wrong with you to what happened to you the next time you might encounter someone in your congregation whose response to something seems a little bit out of proportion. Or the next time you're in a childcare setting and there's a kid who's really acting out or struggling, what else might be going on? Think about that next time you're with a senior. I think in some senior living settings where folks are labeled as disruptive or difficult, what's going on? And what maybe has happened to them in their life that might bring about some greater understanding. So let's move from that ACEs and trauma and that shift to talking about the HOPE framework. And in this context, HOPE stands for Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences. Okay? In 2015, there was a collaboration of physicians led by a Dr. Robert Sege at the HOPE National Resource Center and Tufts University that sought to better understand how positive childhood experiences might correlate with health. The team added 7 questions to a survey that's done nationally, a phone survey called the BRFIS, I know, I have to remember what, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System Survey. It is a national survey, telephone survey that speaks to chronic disease and health issues in the general population. They really wanted to find the answer to the question, why is it that some people who have an ACE score higher than 1 or 2, why is it that some thrive? Some go beyond that and live healthy, productive lives but others don't. So they were trying to answer that question when they added to this survey. What are the protective factors? That's what they wanted to find out, is what are the protective factors that might mitigate the impact of the adverse childhood experiences that may have gone on. The science behind this has also advanced. So there's a greater understanding of what happens in the brain during both negative and positive experiences. So cortisol, as I talked about, adrenaline and cortisol, that's what raises high when you're in the midst of a traumatic or difficult situation. Oxytocin is what happens when it's often referred to as the love hormone. It actually decreases the level of cortisol in individuals when they're in the middle of a situation. It helps to rewire the brain. So it's a new part of the brain understanding that positive experiences actually impact the brain chemistry in the same way, in a similar way to how the negative experiences do. So, whoops. There we go. What the H.O.P.E study found was that much like ACEs and its determination of those 10 adverse childhood experiences we talked about, there are 7 positive childhood experiences that positively impact particularly mental health outcomes long-term, even in the face of adversity and trauma. And these on the slide are the 7 positive experiences that they found to have the greatest impact, particularly on long-term mental health. So let me read them real quickly. Number 1 is that I felt able to talk to family about feelings. I felt my family stood by me in difficult times. I enjoyed participating in community traditions. I felt a sense of belonging, particularly in high school. I felt supported by friends. I had at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in me. And finally, they felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. So think about those 7 experiences. The 2 that are highlighted are the 2 that they found actually had the greatest impact, the greatest protective impact were those top 2. I felt able to talk about my feelings, and I felt my family stood by me in difficult times. The H.O.P.E study shows us that indeed we are not the sum of our adversity. That the A score, while it's important and it's a good screening tool, it's incomplete. There's more to it. The study found that adults with 3 or more ACEs who had any one of the 7 protective factors actually had lower rates of obesity, they had lower rates of smoking, and they had lower rates of poor health, and in fact, the greatest impact was on long-term mental health, as I mentioned. They found that positive childhood experiences protect future adult mental health. Participants that reported having 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences had a 72% lower chance of reporting depression or poor mental health as an adult, when compared to individuals reporting only 0 to 2 positive childhood experiences. When individuals reporting 3 to 5 positive childhood experiences were compared to those reporting 0 to 2, they had a 50% lower rate of depression and poor mental health. There is a relationship between the number of positive childhood experiences and particularly long-term mental health. What I heard just this Wednesday in a training that I attended was that Dr. Sege and his team are actually in the midst of also correlating health, not just mental health, but health. They're in a peer review process of an article that correlates health to positive childhood experiences as well. So through both studies, ACEs and H.O.P.E, we know that adversity doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Positive and adverse things can happen, and often happen, in the same family at the same time. It's also important to note that positive childhood experiences are not the opposite of ACEs. It's not an opposite thing. Just because you don't have a high ACE score doesn't mean you have a lot of positive childhood experiences growing up. In fact, the absence of positive childhood experiences can be as detrimental as 1 to 3 adverse childhood experiences. So positive childhood experiences have huge impact in healing. Now, the HOPE study was focused on childhood adversity and those 7 positive experiences. They speak to mitigating the impact of trauma on children, right? My challenge to you is to think about this for anyone who's experienced trauma at any age. The science has shown that healing happens in relationships. Look at the 7 again. Wouldn't we all be positively impacted if we were able to talk openly about our feelings? Wouldn't we all want to have someone who stands by us in difficult times? Think about the positive feelings you have when you're part of your family or cultural or faith traditions. You belong to something bigger than yourself. Don't we all want to belong? We all benefit from the support of friends. How did you benefit from the presence of those kind, caring adults in your life? And could you be one of those for a youth today? Don't we all want to feel safe and protected in our home? So the HOPE framework also consists of what they're now calling 4 basic building blocks, which describe the types of key positive experiences that are critical to healthy development. This framework was first published in the journal Academic Pediatrics in 2017. And they created these 4 broad categories and called them building blocks. So let's talk a little bit about them. The first of the building blocks is relationships. These are what helps develop secure attachment that buffer stressors in life. These are relationships that might be both internal or external to the family, and these are relationships that are sustained over time. How does your faith community support positive relationships? The second building block is environment, and it's about safe, equitable, stable environments for all. That leads to a sense of predictability and safety. Issues like affordable housing, food insecurity, sufficient sleep, access to medical and dental care, those are all key to that sense of environment. How are you and your faith community here supporting the needs and these social determinants of health? The third building block is around engagement, and it's about needing to feel that you belong and that you matter to the people and communities that are around you. The idea that they're part of something bigger than themselves can create a sense of purpose and mattering. This is also about involvement and opportunities for fun and joy and being together. I also think about opportunities to volunteer and help someone else. That's a part of engagement. I think our faith communities can be all about that. And the fourth of the building blocks is emotional growth. It's having opportunities for social and emotional development. Kids need social and emotional competencies that are going to allow them to constructively get through difficult times. Some people refer to this as emotional intelligence. We need to help our kids develop the ability to talk about and share their emotions. How can our faith communities incorporate that knowledge into everything you do with children or youth? So why do I think this message is important now? Well, okay, think about what we've all lived through in the last 2 years, right? Relative to COVID, the pandemic, it's had an impact on our education systems, our family structures, going from in-person to virtual and back again. Think about the level of isolation we've all experienced over the last 2 years. How many ACEs, thinking back to those 10, how many of ACEs went undetected because people were so isolated from one another? Clearly, there's been an impact on families. because our families have limited access to each other over the last 2 years, and we've lost caregivers, and we've lost the impact of grandparents. We've limited our family holiday celebrations and our rituals. We haven't celebrated weddings the way we like to, and I think significantly funerals over the last 2 years. We have not been allowed to grieve and ritualize the death of a loved one the way that we would like. This is important work because of that. When I also think about the social unrest, particularly here in our cities that we've experienced, I think about the lack of safety that has been exposed, that many in our culture or our communities have experienced for over a lifetime. And for some, that safety and anxiety and fear is new. All of this is about toxic stress. All of this has created a mental health crisis in our communities today. So, how do we integrate hope and the 7 positive experiences into our lives today? First, just you all having an awareness of this and the fact that we all bring our history into our everyday lives changes the dynamic from this is about them to this is about all of us. This is how do we support one another. Be reassured that history isn't destiny. Things can change. None of us has to be a victim to our past. Third, know that healing can happen. Healing can happen. There's no shame in asking for or getting help. So my challenge to you today is to think about the answer to the question, which I often think when I leave a presentation like this, okay, so what can I do? What can I do now that I know this information? Think about your faith community here, your neighborhood, your family, your extended family. This framework isn't about adding to work or giving you something new to do. It's just about thinking differently. What would it look like, sound like, feel like if you promoted and integrated the 7 positive experiences into your everyday life? Think about that. I have a whole lot of questions or ideas just to get you thinking. How much time do we have, Susan?
Do you want to start the Q&A or do you want to start that?
Let me run through these questions and then we will go. Okay. How can we model and teach the vocabulary of feelings so that children have the tools to talk about it? Do you pursue opportunities to engage in meaningful conversation with one another? If you interact with a child care center or an elementary school or a pediatric clinic or any place where parents are present, are you reinforcing positive parenting when you see it? Think about the positive, right? Are you looking at the world from a strengths-based positive lens or using strength-based screening tools in your work? Could you lead with the positive? Could we be teaching parents and grandparents about this, letting them know the value of every positive interaction that they have with children? Every positive interaction is valuable. How about focusing on those 7 positive childhood experiences and those building blocks when you're meeting with new parents who have a child to be baptized? What an opportunity. Could you incorporate this knowledge into confirmation or youth programming? There's a challenge. Are you tending to the basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, for everyone in our community? Are families linked to the services and support that they need? Are you or could you be one of those 2 non-parental, kind and caring adults in the life of a young one? How are the faith and cultural traditions of this community passed on and celebrated? Do we promote intergenerational programming? That has meaning. How are all of our positive experiences and stories shared? Do we give opportunity for that? Are our city and government leaders addressing the safety and protection needed for all of our communities? Are sports or other extracurricular activities that give that sense of belonging, are they accessible to every child? Do your workplaces support employees who are parents of young children? Do you encourage active engagement between child and parents at any age? What would happen if all of your neighbors, all of your staff, all of your friends were trained in both ACEs and HOPE? Not an either or, but both. Again, what would it look like, sound like, feel like if HOPE was integrated into your everyday life? If this information has piqued your interest and you want to know more, you can always call me, but probably the best resource out there is this website, which is www.positiveexperience.org. I have found it to be packed full of resources and materials. I have also had personal conversations with Dr. Sege, who was one of the initial authors of the study. He is incredibly accessible and willing to assist anybody. So he's a great resource, but I would point everybody to this website. In closing, let me just share one last thing. I was recently at a convening around the healthy outcomes of positive experiences, and I heard it referred to as the science of possibilities. Think about that. Healing is possible. Growth is possible, even in the face of trauma and adversity. Much like the sunflower orients to the sun, we can reorient to the positive. And let me, something went funky here. Let me just close with a quote that is one of my favorites. And it says, "The future belongs to those who give the next generation a reason to have hope." I think we can take questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. We really appreciate this talk. I actually heard Anne speak for the parish nurses, and I think I immediately emailed her and said, we need this talk here at our church, in our community, to reach out and start conversations. And all of her questions at the end are questions that I've thought of, like how can we reach out? For you, those of you that are here or are watching online and have registered, the resources she talked about are on this page that I included in the email that you received. If you want these resources and her slides, they're both available if you email social@spdlc.org. And they're very helpful. I also have the book with me, The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. It was written in 2014. It's, Clay, do you want to grab that book? It's right there. It's a kind of a large book.
It's a dense read, but it's a good one.
Not that not as heavy as my college biology book, but it's a really good book. It's, what did you say about that?
I said it's a dense read.
It is,
but
a
it's
dense
a good one.
read, but it's a really good book if you want a challenge. But and there's also chapters that might be more of interest to you to grab at and look at, but that is also listed on your resource guide here. So I think that's so important.
Do you have the new What Happened to You book?
I do not have
on your list? Okay. That's the book that was written, co-authored by Oprah.
Oh, okay.
So it's had a lot of exposure, but it is good, and it speaks a lot to the positive experiences and the impact on trauma. Great. It's called What Happened to You.
And the positiveexperience.org is on here, and Dr. Nadine Burke's, TED Talk is also listed on here for you, and it's a TED Talk, so it's short and it's pretty easy. But I have Does anybody have any questions that you have now, or comments, or ways you think that you in our community can help? Help with our spread hope that with childhood adverse
Healthy outcomes from positive experiences.
So do you have any positive experiences you think that the church gives or can give or promote more? Yes.
I have a super basic question. It might be considered a dumb one. On your second slide.
Do you want to come up here to the microphone?
I don't, but.
We'll repeat it for you.
All right. The second slide where you list the 10
Yes.
adverse childhood experiences, the different colors in the font.
Yes.
What kind of grouping is that?
That's just how they grouped the 10 into emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. That just was an easier way to depict them. And I've seen a couple of graphics where they're in different columns. It's just how they describe them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I'll come to the mic.
Yay, Rachel.
So I work with little kids here at church. I work with the little ones. And I know, I know from my training that a lot of development happens before or during the age of 3. Is there a bigger or a different impact if it happens when they're 3 or before versus the rest of childhood, you know, until they're 18 or whatever? Have you heard of any
I have
difference in
not
that?
heard them talk about either ACEs or HOPE from an age bracket perspective. That's interesting. I have not seen anything like that. But as you say, we know the greatest percentage of brain development happens in the first 3 years of life.
Right.
Do you know about the statewide resource called Little Moments Count?
No.
Google Little Moments Count and you will find a whole lot of information that is for the community to use around early childhood brain development.
Awesome.
Thanks. That was a good question too, and I work with seniors, so also, and you think about that, and I think I can see every day just by doing something kind, and I've written a little thing on kindness, just doing little things. It doesn't have to be big things like starting a big program like Clay does for our confirmation students. Clay, you can come up here too if you want to answer any questions. But, you know, it can be little things like seeing someone. I saw a couple, one of them obviously had dementia, coming to Dairy Queen to eat, and I was getting out of my car, and I made sure I said hi to them and recognize them. Just seeing people who are of any age in the community that you know, make a point of saying hi or getting to know them.
You matter.
You matter, and
You
I
matter.
always
And you belong.
make sure when I see somebody's name tag on at any store that I'm at, I go, well, thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate that. Or have a good day, Margaret, or something, because people don't always, you know, they have their name tag on, but calling people by their name is so important to recognizing them and seeing them day by day. But I just think this information is so important for all of us, just to do little things every day, and that can make a small ripple to make a big difference in our community, and we really want our community to be strong. Clay, what do you have to say? Do you have anything you want to add?
I actually have a question that's kind of rattling around my brain. It starts with the idea that trauma isn't static from person to person, that your experience of loss will affect you different than me.
Yes.
And I run down the list of all the ACEs, and I start thinking about our middle schoolers. We asked them to write a faith statement at the end of confirmation, and at least half of them talk about some kind of loss. And it's very profound, but then the other half don't mention it at all. I'm just curious if there's any insights on the fact that trauma isn't static, and that we quantify the ACEs and then put percentages to outcomes down the road. Is there any insights to kind of how we can weight these, or?
I think the question you're asking is exactly where this came from.
Yeah.
how is it that trauma affects individuals so differently? So when I think about that, I think about what's the level of positive experience that counters that loss for kids. In some families, clearly, they're able to talk about their feelings. They're able to verbalize loss and sorrow and sadness and all of that. And in some families, they don't ever talk about it. So I think it's sort of matching the response to what might be missing in their lives. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Kind of balance the equation.
Yeah. And figuring out how you, as you interact with those folks, those little folks, can build any one of these positive childhood experiences so that it mitigates the impact of that trauma for them.
And I find it interesting that some kids do speak to it and some don't, but they get to read everyone's faith statement. Is that correct, Clay?
Everyone who puts one in the book, yeah.
So the kids that don't put anything adverse in maybe go, oh, maybe I should have talked about this. So that's a ripple effect to them, you know, that they understand, oh, you know, it's not all...
It's not just me?
It's not just me. There's somebody else. And that's what you want. You want to open the room that says, oh, it's not just me. There's someone else. You don't want to be that isolated kid in high school that doesn't feel like it. And so by them not saying something, they might have something and realize, well, they might talk to that kid too about it. So it's a great opportunity for them to open things. And
yeah, it's shifting that thinking from it's about those people to it's about all of us. And we all have stories, whether we share them or not. But we all have the potential for mitigating factors, like those positive experiences.
And if you want to learn about stories, we had a storyteller here last year, and he did a great job. And you can revisit that on our YouTube channel, right? Is that how we get it too? So anyway, Anne.
I was just going to follow up with when Clay talked about balancing the equation and your response, and I want to make sure I didn't interpret it backwards, because I took it as if a student is brave enough to mention it in, for example, their faith story as a 14, 15-year-old. To me, that means they've had the positive childhood experiences of number 1 and 2.
Yep.
But that isn't representative of the number who have experienced it.
Correct.
Because I believe they all have had some sense of loss or something that spoke to their faith, but they didn't put it in because their family doesn't talk about difficult things.
Right.
Okay.
Or they had an outlet and they don't need to anymore.
Okay.
Don't assume,
Yep.
but you might move forward thinking about that. Again, this is not about changing your work.
No.
It's not about adding more to your work. It's just about thinking differently.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have some resources for how families can talk about feelings?
Ooh. I know there's some on the H.O.P.E resource page, that website that I mentioned, the positive experiences. I know there's some there.
I have a few that I use when I teach feelings to my lay ministers, and they are like little charts with little faces on them, and you can point to how you're feeling, and you can use that in a family conversation at night, you know, when you're eating dinner, and say about an experience you had during the day, each person, and you can point to how you feel about that. And sometimes that's easier for people to point to a picture than
to
actually
verbalize,
verbalize it. And that might be a way to start a conversation.
That's a really good idea. We have a magnet like that at home.
Yep.
Okay, and I have,
Kids will probably just laugh and it'd probably be good.
and it is funny, you know, or they can draw the picture. That might even be funnier.
But it takes practice.
Yeah.
It takes practice putting the words out there and hearing each other say them. That is not natural for a lot of folks, and you have to practice.
Dr. Joshua Straub has a really good book for kids and or families. I can move forward if you want me to. He was a Faith and Life speaker last year, and we have his book, Joshua Straub is his name. And then there's also, if you just go online and Google Feelings Wheel,
Yes.
there's a really simple one that can be good for any age, and then it expands out to 2 or 3 layers based on how how in-depth you want to get or different types of feelings. Those are really good, especially with different ages. So then if you do mad, or are you frustrated, or are you, it goes back. So those are good. I've done with preschoolers pictures of their faces. This is what I look like, angry. What do you look like? You take your picture and then you make a chart of them. And that's easy to see them too. So I teach feelings for a living.
One of the exercises that we've done in the faith leader training is sort of a scale. And you take one word and you put in the middle of it angry and ask everybody to use another word that describes anger or angry, and then put it on the scale of this doesn't, this means this, and this is like I'm really pissed off. And just see the extended number of words we have for that one feeling. It just gets people thinking about the language we use or don't use to describe our feelings.
So it sounds like if we could all just learn to talk more about our feelings and our families talk about the feelings and start at a very simple level, that would be a great way to start with everyone, and to teach that in our programs as much as we can too, without causing disruption, I guess, in the program. So is there anyone else that has questions? And I don't know.
Where are we?
We are close to Clay giving a they told me that I'm supposed to tell you again that the handouts are available on social, if you request them on social at spdlc.org, which I think I already told you, but I'm going to remind you of that again because I was reminded to do that. So is there anything else you'd like to close with, Ann?
No, I think there's a significant shift in our thinking when we start with the positive. It's easy to go negative. And that's my challenge to you, is start with the positive and think about particularly these 7 things that have significant impact for those who've experienced trauma.
And if anybody heard Bishop Michael Curry, who was our Faith and Life, was it last week already? Or the week before, he talks about love and moving from a place of love, which is another way to say positive. And I would suggest you go and look at that on our YouTube channel also. He was amazing, and he will be back here in May 9th, 2023. So we're hoping that in person, so we're hoping that will happen. So thank you so much. If there's more questions, send them to social at spdlc.org. We'll be happy to answer them. We'll be happy to send out more of the information that we had tonight. I want to thank Ann so much.
Welcome.
And I want to thank also our fantastic tech crew, who is Darren back there in the booth, and Paul, and Kate also, thank you guys, and Renee, our middle school ministry support staff, for all your help with tonight, and Rachel for the photos and for speaking up tonight, and all the SPD staff that helped us tonight. And Clay is going to end with a prayer, and thank you very much for coming and being a part of this conversation. Please keep the conversation going, and don't be afraid to talk about your feelings.
I'll close us with this. It's a prayer kind of poetically written by Todd Loader. Oh God, empty me of angry judgments and aching disappointments and anxious trying, and breathe into me something like quietness and confidence, that the lion and the lamb may lay down together and be led by a trust as straightforward as a little child. Catch my pride and doubt off guard, that at least for the moment I may sense your presence and your caring, and be surprised by a sudden joy rising in me now to sustain me in the coming then. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you again for tonight. It's been wonderful. Drive safe, and God bless.
Go in peace.